This is all I need to create a killer cinematic filmic look to make night scenes look like this. First, I'll show you how I use the push and pull technique to create an easy cinematic contrast, then how I set up the film look creator to create the base of the color grade, after that which parts to tweak to finalize the color grade, and then what I use as the final cherry on top to finalize the filmic look. So make sure to stick till the end. Also, two quick disclaimers. Number one, this is my personal process for color grading and creating cinematic filmic looks. It's not a golden standard. So treat it as a starting point for your color grading, or if you want to create also cinematic filmic looks. And number two, I use the film look creator, which is only available in DaVinci Resolve 19 Studio, but don't click away just yet. This tutorial will contain a lot of color grading information, which will be useful to you anyway. So let's jump in. So once I'm in the color page, first things first, I'm gonna set up my node tree. So I got two color space transform nodes for input and output, noise reduction, push and pull, where we are going to create the cinematic contrast, the FLC, not FC, my bad. This is going to be our main node for the look. Color adjustments, it's going to be our second node that will help us with the colors for the look, and glow will be the cherry on top for the entire color grade. Now, the second thing I do in the color page is go to scopes and make sure my waveform is up and running. And then I'm going to go to project settings, to color management, and make sure my color sense is set to DaVinci YRGB. My timeline color space is DaVinci White Gamut Intermediate. And my output color space is going to be Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. And I work in the DaVinci color space because, as you can see in this image, the DaVinci color space is superior to Rec 709. Because it preserves a larger range of colors and luminance, preventing clipping and loss of detail, especially with modern cameras, or if I want to use a HDR workflow. And besides this, it offers me greater flexibility if I want to do extreme color grades without losing any quality at all. Now, to make the color management visible, I'm going to click on my CST in, go to the effects, and grab the color space transform. For input color space, I'm going to set Panasonic V Gamut because the footage is from a Panasonic camera, Panasonic V-Log. And for output color space, I'm going to set DaVinci White Gamut with DaVinci Intermediate. Then I'm going to select library again, grab the color space transform, and add it to my CST out. Here, I'm going to set the input color space to DaVinci White Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, and the output to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. Now that we have our footage color managed, let's close out the effects tab and let's go to push and pull. I am going to skip noise reduction because I'm going to talk about it later in the video. So click on push and pull, and in our primaries page, primaries color wheel, we have lift, gamma, and gain, and we're going to grab lift and raise it up to 0.04, gamma to around 0.03, and we're gonna drop the gain, or pull the gain in this case, because we're using push and pull, and we're gonna pull it to around 0.85. Good. Why am I keeping these values? It's quite simple. For the look I like to create, going above 0.04 or 0.05 for the lift makes the footage too washed out, and I really don't like that. So 0.04 or 0.05 is kind of like a sweet spot for me. Same goes for gain. If I go too low, I lose a lot of light, so around 0.85, 0.90 is perfect for me. Now, still in the primaries page, we're gonna go to log, and here we have shadow, midtones, and highlights. We're gonna grab the shadow and lift it to around 0.10, grab the midtones and raise them to the same value, and now grab the highlights and drop them to the negative value of the midtones and shadows, which is minus 0.10. Again, these are sweet spot settings I use, so do not treat them like they are settings set in stone or the golden rule for color grading. Just take what you need from what you see in this tutorial and use it as a starting point. Now, if you're wondering, hey, lift, gamma, gain kind of do the same thing as shadow, midtones, and highlights, so why are you using both? Well, let me show you. Gamma, actually, let me pop up waveform. And now if I increase gamma, as you can see, it also drags along with it the shadows and the darker areas of my footage and brightens them up. And I don't want that. So I use gamma to set a kind of a big picture look. Same goes for lift and gain. And then with log, and just fine tune the areas that I want. As you can see, even with shadows, it doesn't move the midtones or the highlights like lift, gamma, gain do. Close this out. Now let's grab the contrast slider and raise it up to around 1.2. Anything above 1.2 kind of makes your footage burned, and I don't like that, so I'm sticking below 1.2 or around 1.2. Now I'm gonna grab the pivot and I'm gonna lower it. So if you don't know what pivot does, it's basically like a middle point for your contrast. So if you increase the contrast and also increase the pivot point, you're going to add contrast to your darker areas in the scene. But if you lower it, you're gonna add contrast only to the brighter areas of your scene. And since we're gonna go for that filmic faded look, we don't want too much contrast in our darker areas or shadows. We only want it in the brighter areas and mid. So for contrast, 1.190, and for pivot, around 0.23, it's a really good sweet spot. Next, we're gonna jump into curves. We're gonna unlink the channels so we can use them individually. Remain with the Y channel, grab the highlights and drag it out just a little bit. Now bring the shadow point or black point up just a little bit. And now I usually add 4 points on the curve to create my S curve for the contrast. So first one is gonna be around the highlights to midtones area. I'm gonna bring that up, also paying attention to my footage and the scopes. The second point is gonna be around the middle of the graph. Okay, bring this one down. Perfect. Now I'm gonna add one right at the ramp up of the graph. Bring it down a little bit. And one somewhere between these two spikes. Bring it down and now fine tune it to around here. Perfect. Now let's do a short recap. So we used our primaries, lift, gamma, gain, to open up the image, then our log wheels to fine tune the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Then we added contrast only to the brighter areas of the scene. And finally, we dialed in our contrast for the entire image using the tone curve tool. Now let's move on to the main piece of this tutorial, which is the film look creator. First, select the node, then go to the effects and grab the film look creator. Now by default, it's gonna give you the default 65mm, and we do not want that. So click on the presets and choose clean slate. Color blend and effects I keep at 100% or value of 1 because I want the full effect of the colors and the effects themselves. Now 3D LUT compatible, I keep this unchecked because if you check it, it's gonna eliminate a few of the effects, so you can make this entire thing exportable into a 3D LUT. But since we're gonna not export it, I'm keeping this off. Next, color space override. Basically, if you would have used the film look creator as a standalone effect, you would have set your color space right here. But since I'm already using color space transform, I'm just gonna leave as use timeline because my timeline right now is in the DaVinci white gamut. So I don't need to set it again. Now, white point, output white point is set to D65 by default. D65 refers to a standardized white point used as a reference for color temperature. Specifically, it represents a correlated color temperature of 6500 Kelvin, which is considered daylight under normal sky conditions. And this reference point is also considered a neutral white point, often used in Rec 709 or Rec 2020 color spaces, making it kind of like a default white point for monitor calibration, photography, videography, and that is why I use it in all my color grades. Now, for the film look, I'm gonna crank it up to the max and leave the core look to cinematic. I find that cinematic is kind of like a middle point between Rochester, Akasaka, Elated, and Vintage. So it truly is like the middle ground between all of them. Now I'm gonna dial it down a little because I don't want it to be in full force. So around 0.65 something is really good for me, usually. Now for skin bias, I set it to minus 0.2425 because if you go to, for example, -1, this will give you warmer, darker, and more saturated skins. While if you go to +1, you're gonna get less saturated, brighter, and more rosy skin tones. So even though I don't have a person in this shot, I will set it to minus 0.2425 just to future-proof this look. Next, for color settings, exposure and contrast, I'm gonna leave at 0 and 1 because I already have the brightness and contrast is set with the push and pull node. So I don't need to adjust these. Next, highlights, I'm gonna tone these down quite a lot, but not too much, because if you can see in car light, if I go to 0, it's really completely muted and I don't want that. So I'm gonna stick to around 0.2 something. Go 0.258 in this case. It's perfect. Now for fade, we're gonna increase it, and for example, we can go to a pretty washed up effect with a value of 1, but I don't like that, even though it looks very vintage and very filmic. I really like it to have a lower value, so I'm gonna match it somewhat with the highlights value. Okay, let me tone it down just a little bit. Perfect. Now for white balance and tint, I'm going to lower the white balance from 6,500 to 5,700 because I want my footage to be a bit cooler, especially during the night. And for tint, I'm gonna leave it at 10 because of some adjustments I'm gonna do later. Also, the white balance and tint in the Film Look Creator use chromatic adaptation to mimic how the source footage might look like if it were shot under real lighting conditions or under limited lighting spectrum, such as fluorescent or vapor sodium lights. Next, subtractive saturation. Here I'm just gonna increase it ever so slightly. Same goes for richness. Just eyeballing my footage. See how much subtractive saturation, I need, and richness. And if you're wondering what subtractive saturation and richness do, because if you crank them up, they kind of do the same thing, but not exactly. Well, subtractive saturation increases the saturation of the footage, but it does not increase its brightness. For example, if I were to use a normal saturation slider, you'd see that even the brighter areas get saturated. As with subtractive saturation, these do not. Now, richness, well, richness behaves exactly like subtractive saturation, except for one thing. Richness adds saturation to the already saturated parts. So if you have something that is saturated by subtractive saturation and it's somewhat intense, richness will only increase the saturation in those overly saturated areas. So I increase the saturation with subtractive saturation and then just put a little bit of cherries on top with richness. That's why I increase them ever so slightly, because we're gonna add a different type of saturation later on in the process. So we don't need to crank them up right here. Now, bleach bypass, this is a cool effect if you want to mimic the 300 movie effect, but it doesn't serve our look, so we're gonna leave it at 0. Now, split tone is another cherry on top for our look. Let's enable it and increase the amount to 1 to see it in full force. And now we're gonna switch the colors. Actually, let me bring the waveform up so you can see what colors we get in the highlights and in the shadows. Right now we have red, green, and a bit of cyan. But if I change the angle, you can see how the colors change. Again, in shadows and highlights. So for my cinematic filmic look, I tend to have the purple bluish shadows and somewhat yellow-green highlights, somewhere around here. Now I'm gonna grab the pivot and shift the colors. So if I go to 0, the highlights color are more predominant. But if I go to +1, the shadow colors are more predominant. So I like to have them somewhere around 0.3, which kind of gives me a good balance between them. Actually, let me tone it down just a little bit on the shadows. Okay, this is it, the sweet spot, 0.284. Now, vignette, I hate it. I'm not gonna use it. I never use it. So let's move on to halation. Let's enable halation and disable for highlights only. Let me increase the amount so you can see this would be for highlights only. But if I remove it, we get it all over the footage. And also, almost forgot to do one thing. Let's dial in the amount of the split tone because we don't want this to be our final look. So let me bring it down to around 0.5. Perfect. Now let me tone down also the amount of the halation because we don't want this to be too soft. Increase the radius a bit and increase the hue towards the red color, which means decreasing the value basically, somewhere around 0.2. Good. Now let's close halation and move to bloom. Enable bloom. Let's decrease the amount and also the radius somewhere around here for this specific scene because we have a lot of light and reflections. Otherwise, if you didn't have so much light or reflections, you could have just increased it to near max values. But in this case, I'm going to leave it to a radius of 62 and an amount of 0.7. Now let's close bloom and go to grain. And I'm just going to enable grain and leave it as is because the default settings for 35 millimeters are exactly what I need in my footage. Let's zoom in, disable, enable, and we're good to go. Now I advise you to disable grain if you still have some color grading to do or any other type of editing, because grain can tend to slow down your machine depending on your hardware. So disable it for the time being and re-enable it once you're at the rendering phase. Now, flicker, gate weave, and film gate are effects to mimic how film jitters and whatever in the camera, like in the olden days. So we're not going to touch those. And global blend is just a blend slider. We're not going to use it, so we can move on. Now let's close out of the effects tab and go to color adjustments and continue our filmic look. Let's go to the tone curve tool, select the blue channel, and based on your graph in the tone curve tool, press and hold Alt or Option on your keyboard and set 2 points at the outer edges of the spike on the graph to create like a limit range. Now let's grab a point on curve and drag it down to add more yellow scene and play around with the position of your point to determine where exactly from shadows to highlights you're gonna add your yellow. You can also check it in the waveform. I believe somewhere around here is good for me in this case. So we're gonna leave it and go to the color warper. Here I'm gonna switch from 6 points to 12 and I'm gonna leave it at SHP and pop it out so you can see it better. Now from the center to the edges, you're going to affect the saturation, and if you go clockwise or counterclockwise, you're gonna change the hue of the colors in your footage. So in my case, I'm gonna take everything that is yellow and orange and move it towards orange red, red more towards orange, magenta towards red and orange, yellow green to yellow orange, green to aqua, aqua to blue, purple to blue, and blue slightly to aqua. Basically creating this spider-like shape in my color warper. Now that I have changed the hues how I want, I'm going to close out and go back to the tone curve tool and choose a different type of curve. In this case, I'm going to choose the hue versus hue. Here, I'm gonna set a point on the graph between red and green, and I'm gonna dial in all the yellows and oranges towards orange. And the same for blue. I'm gonna dial it in towards aqua. If I go down, it's gonna go to blue purple. So I'm gonna go up, blue aqua. Let me bring this in a little bit. You can also see it in the waveform, but usually you pay attention to your footage. Like here and here in my case. Next, I'm gonna go to the luminance versus saturation curve. And here I'm gonna set a point right before the graph starts and one around here where the spike goes down, and basically lift it up and increase the saturation only in the brightest parts of the footage. Basically, this curve allows you to target specific brightness levels in your image and add saturation to it or subtract saturation from it without affecting any other brightness ranges. For example, if you have bright yellow areas in your image, you can specifically target those yellow areas, manipulate them however you want by adding or removing saturation without affecting anything else in the image. Something like this. Now let's do a quick recap. So with the film look creator, we chose the cinematic setting. We dialed in how much of the film look we want. We made sure that the skin is towards warmer, darker colors. Then we muted the highlights a little bit, increased a fade so we get that faded film look, set the white balance to a colder tone, left the tint where it is, increased the saturation a little bit, then set our split tones to which colors we want to be predominant in the highlights and in the shadows. Then we added some halation, some bloom, and some grain. Then we moved to a color adjustment node where we dialed in the saturation for the brighter areas of our footage. We added a little bit of yellow in our overall image, then shifted the hues for every color in our video. Then we dialed in only the yellows and oranges and blues and aquas and increased the saturation for all of them. And now we are ready to move on to the final piece of our color grade, which is the glow. Select the node, and first thing that we're going to do here is drop the shine threshold to around 009 or 0010. Next, most important thing we need to do in the glow node is to go to composite type and switch it from add to soft light. Now if you're wondering, hey, we added glow to brighten up the image and now we're gonna just make it disappear, well, not exactly. We're gonna grab the spread slider and lower it to around 0.5, 0.6, because if we increase it too much, it's gonna cover the entire footage and we don't want that. So we wanna have it only over the brightest areas in our footage, basically like a light wrap around the brighter areas of the footage. Now I'm going to decrease the gain also ever so slightly, increase the gamma. This is basically like gain drops the highlights, but gamma increases the midtones in this case, and also increase the saturation. And I'm gonna change the color from white to whatever color I want. So I can go for, let's say, yellow orange or blue, basically going for whatever film look you want to mimic. In my case, I'm gonna leave it towards this middle ground blue color because it looks the best in my eyes. And click OK, close the effects tab, and let's play back our footage. Looking really good. First, we color managed our footage using color space transform. Then we created our cinematic contrast. After that, with the film look creator, we created the base of our color grade. Then we dialed in a few colors and saturation with our color adjustment node. And finally, we put the cherry on top with a tinted glow. Now, before we go on with saving this look and applying it to other clips in your project, I double checked the color grade and I noticed that I went a bit too hard with the blues in the shadows. So to fix this, I'm gonna select the film look creator and go to split tone, grab the hue angle and slide it to the right a little bit to change what colors I have in the shadows and the highlights. And then grab the pivot and move it towards the left to introduce more warm tones into the look. Somewhere around here, looks good. Now I'm gonna tone it down just a little bit. Good. Now I'm gonna select the color adjustment node, and in the primaries log wheels, I'm gonna grab the middle point of the midtones and drag it up, trying to aim at a 45-degree angle between orange and yellow, somewhere around here. And then the highlights, I'm gonna grab it and drag it towards the left, maintaining the line, adding a little bit of yellow green into the highlight. Okay, let's see if I change also the glow, but I don't think we need to. No, we don't. Okay. Now, in order to save this look, you right click and you grab a still, then you open the gallery, and here you have your PowerGrade. Now let's open up the clips, and I have 3 different clips where we can apply the look to see if we need to adjust it or if this is a one-click color grade. Now let's select the first one, right click on the PowerGrade and apply grade. And if I were to change something, I would just tone down the teal, but I like how it is. So let's move on to the next one. Right click, PowerGrade. This looks great out of the box as well. Third one, let's see if third one's a lucky charm. And here I would probably, let's see, we have blue purple. Grab the film look creator, go to split tone, and if I change the angle, okay, if we move it to the right a little bit, and also the pivot to the right a little bit. Now we get that more bluish than purple, and it looks more towards Blade Runner or Cyberpunk. And that's how you save a look as a PowerGrade and apply it to other clips. Now, in the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned that we're going to talk about noise reduction a bit later in the video. Well, I did that because there are 2 methods of applying noise reduction in DaVinci Resolve, and both of them are explained in this video right here.